Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, 22 senators speak out on Vietnam. In the Deep South, public schools in 4 states are integrated. In Boston, a serial strangler remains at large. Robert Kennedy speaks to American Indians. Frank Sinatra is linked to a mobster. And the New York Yankees win their 28th pennant. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Scotty's new Magic Oval box. Only Scotty's give you tissues that float up gently, one at a time, and come out in neat handfuls too, because there's a Magic Oval inside every new Scotty's box. Only Scotty's Magic Oval can give you tissues that float up, smooth and easy. No tugging, no tearing, no extra tissues tagging along. And Scotty's Magic Oval does even more. It lets you reach in for tissues by the handful, all neatly folded, just right for pocket or purse. Look for Scotty's pretty new Magic Oval box, the only one of its kind.
In Washington yesterday, 22 U.S. senators introduced a resolution advocating the termination of aid to South Vietnam unless the Diem regime stops persecuting Buddhists in that country and seeks popular support. In presenting the resolution, with support from colleagues from both parties, Democratic Senator Frank Church of Idaho said, quote, "The loss of South Vietnam to communism would be deplorable, and especially bitter, after so long and agonizing an effort there. But in the end, South Vietnam will fall victim to the relentless communist penetration unless the Diem regime abandons its policies of repression or another non-communist regime emerges to rally the people. To persist in the support of such a regime can only serve to identify the U.S. with the cause of religious persecution, undermining our moral position throughout the world. We have turned our eyes away from the sacrificial protests of Buddhist monks burning themselves alive on the streets of Saigon. Such grisly scenes have not been witnessed since the Christian martyrs marched hand in hand into the Roman arenas." Unquote. Among the Democrats signing the resolution were some of President Kennedy's strongest supporters, including Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, Wayne Morse of Oregon, Edmund Muskie of Maine, and Ralph Yarborough of Texas. At yesterday's press conference, President Kennedy was asked for his reaction to Senator Church's resolution.
His resolution reflects his concern. He's particularly interested in the Far East, and Senator Carlson and some other senators. I've indicated my feeling that we should stay there and continue to assist South Vietnam. But I have also indicated our feeling that the assistance we give should be used in the most effective way possible. I think that seems to be Senator Church's view.
The president was asked to state this country's policy toward the current government of South Vietnam.
We are for those things which, and those policies which help win the war there. That's why some 25,000 Americans have traveled 10,000 miles to participate in that struggle. What helps to win the war, we support. What interferes with the war effort, we oppose. I've already made it clear that any action by either government which may handicap the winning of the war is inconsistent with our policy or our objectives. This is the test which I think every agency and official of the United States government must apply to all of our actions. And we shall be applying that test in various ways in the coming months, although I do not think it desirable to state all of our views at this time. I think they'll be made more clear as time goes on. But we've got a very simple policy in that area. I think that, and in some ways, I think the Vietnamese people and ourselves agree. We want the war to be won, the communists to be contained, and the Americans to go home. That is our policy. I'm sure it's the policy of the people of Vietnam. But we are not there to see a war lost. And we will follow the policy which I've indicated today of advancing those causes and issues which help win the war.
Finally, the president was asked to respond to recent criticism that he was operating on the basis of faulty and incomplete information about the true situation in South Vietnam.
I'm operating on the basis of the unanimous views and opinions expressed by most experienced Americans there in the military, diplomatic, aid agency, Voice of America, and others who have only one interest, and that is to see the war successful as quickly as possible. In addition, I think we are fortunate, as I've said before, to have Ambassador Lodge there, who, and I will say that any statement that I've made expressing concern about the situation there reflects his view, and it reflects it in a very moderate way.
Earlier today, in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, Madame No Dinh Nhu, South Vietnam's powerful de facto First Lady, had a surprise meeting with the president's brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, who later said she had, quote, discussed her side of the picture at length, unquote. 12 American legislators from both parties are in Belgrade for a conference of the Interparliamentary Union. Upon arriving at the conference earlier this week, Madame Nhu had accused President Kennedy of appeasement and of being misinformed about the South Vietnamese government's actions against the Buddhists. Today, Madame Nhu spent 90 minutes with the president's brother, who took notes during the almost completely one-sided conversation. In Alabama this week, 20 Negroes attended previously all-white schools in 4 cities after President Kennedy's federalization of the state's National Guard ended the defiance of Governor George Wallace. In Birmingham, police arrested 12 whites who were involved in a rowdy 2-hour demonstration over the admission of 2 Negro girls to West End High School under a federal court order. Many students and a few teachers walked out of classes and were greeted by cheers from the demonstrators. Only 500 of an expected 1,500 students remained in the school. Eventually, Birmingham police and riot squads dispersed the crowd. The Birmingham incident did not, however, represent a general trend this week, as there were no such incidents at the other Alabama schools, 4 in Huntsville and 1 each in Tuskegee and Mobile. In addition, previously all-white schools in Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia were also integrated this week without any major incidents. At yesterday's press conference, President Kennedy was asked if a major turning point had been reached in this area or if he saw continued step-by-step progress from one city to another.
Step by step, I would think. What is impressive, as I said, and I don't think we realize the full significance of it, is that most of the work really has been done by Southerners themselves. In the case of Alabama, the 5 federal judges who signed that order were all from Alabama, all grew up in Alabama, I'm sure, shared the views of the majority of Alabamans, who I think are not for desegregation, but nevertheless met their responsibilities under the law, which we're trying to do. And I think what's happened in South Carolina, Florida, the last few days, Georgia, I think it's an impressive story. It's slow, it's step by step, it will continue that way, but this nation's passing through a very grueling test, and with the exception of a few aberrations, I think we're meeting it, and I say we in the national sense, we as a country are doing quite well. We have to do better, but I think there's some cause for satisfaction in most of the events that happened in the last 2 weeks.
In a related question, Mr. Kennedy was asked about a recent Gallup poll about the administration's policy on integration.
Agents of Dr. Gallup asked people this question: do you think the Kennedy administration is pushing integration too fast or not fast enough? 50% replied that they thought you were pushing too fast. Would you comment?
No, I think probably he's accurate. The fact of the matter is, this is not a matter on which you can take the temperature every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on what the newspaper headlines must be. I think you must make a judgment about the movement of a great historical event which is taking place in this country after a period of time. You judged 1863 after a good many years. Its full effect, I think we will stand on after a period of time has gone by. The fact is, that same poll showed 40% or so thought it was more or less right. I thought that was rather impressive because it is change. Change always disturbs, and therefore I was surprised that there wasn't greater opposition. I think we're going at about the right tempo.
I'll have more news for you after this message.
Minute Brew Nescafe is a new discovery, a new way to hold in extra rich flavor. So please help us. Let it brew in the cup a few seconds longer for all that extra flavor to come out. In other words, with Minute Brew Nescafe, it takes a little longer, but you get a lot more coffee. If you agree it takes more than an instant to make a real cup of coffee, buy this completely new kind of coffee today. New Minute Brew Nescafe. It's more than an instant, yet costs no more. New Minute Brew Nescafe.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In a quiet residential neighborhood in Salem, Massachusetts Sunday, a 58-year-old woman was strangled to death with a nylon stocking in her apartment. The victim was 58-year-old Evelyn Corbin, who lived alone in a room on the first floor. She was the 10th woman to be strangled to death in the Boston area since June 14th of last year. The victims have ranged in age from 20 to 85. Mrs. Corbin's body was found by a close friend and neighbor, 66-year-old Flora Manchester, who became deeply distraught and was put under sedation. Later, she said of Mrs. Corbin, quote, "She was a very good girl and just like a daughter to me. Her birthday was last Friday, and I baked a cake for her. She was a very happy person. I never saw her depressed. She was in very good spirits this morning. She left to go to Mass with plans to come over for dinner. Now I find this awful thing has happened," unquote. City Marshal John Tully said it was not yet known whether Mrs. Corbin had been sexually assaulted. In the other 9 cases, rape was detected in 6 of them and suspected in 2 others. Salem police reported that, as with the previous attacks, there was no evidence of forcible entry into Mrs. Corbin's apartment. State Police Lieutenant Joseph Kelleher said there was no prime suspect in the murders. On Wednesday, the Nevada Gaming Control Board issued a complaint against Frank Sinatra, charging the 47-year-old singer with hosting Sam Giancana, a Chicago underworld figure, at Mr. Sinatra's Lake Tahoe resort, the Cal Neva. Mr. Giancana was described in the complaint as, quote, "one of the 12 overlords of the mafia," unquote. The board charged that Mr. Giancana had stayed at the Cal Neva for 11 days in July of this year, in a room, quote, "registered to a female performer, then appearing at the casino," unquote. Mr. Giancana is a friend of Phyllis McGuire, a member of the Singing McGuire sisters, who were featured at the resort at that time. The board also accused Mr. Sinatra of using, quote, "vile, obscene language in a tone which was menacing to the extreme and constituted a threat against the chairman of the control board," unquote. The complaint also said that Mr. Sinatra had attempted coercion and that one of the singer's representatives had tried to bribe 2 state gaming agents. Mr. Sinatra has 15 days to answer the complaint, after which the board will set a hearing on the charges. In Bismarck, North Dakota today, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy lamented the fact that the American Indian, quote, "has for so long been denied a full share of freedom," unquote. Mr. Kennedy spoke at the 20th Annual Convention of the National Congress of American Indians.
The Indians have been ruined by a competition which they did not have the means of sustaining. Their health is so poor that their rate of infant mortality is nearly twice that of any other racial group in this country. That these conditions can be allowed to prevail among a people uniquely entitled to call themselves the first Americans, a people whose civilization flourished here for centuries before the name America was thought of, this is nothing less than a national disgrace.
Following today's speech, Mr. Kennedy spoke with reporters.
I think the focus of attention is on Negroes now because of the large numbers of Negroes spread all across the country, and people are much more aware of it. But I think that this effort has to be made on behalf of all these groups and who are subject to injustices. And I think that includes Eskimos, includes the Indians, Latin Americans, who in some parts of our country have the equivalent only of a third-year education. And it includes in some areas of the country Chinese and Japanese. And I don't think that we're meeting our responsibilities if we just do it as far as the Negroes are concerned.
On Monday, during an interview on NBC TV, the Attorney General said the administration's civil rights policies could have an adverse effect on his brother's chances for re-election in 1964, but added, quote, "I think we have to do it," unquote. The topic of 1964 was also raised at President Kennedy's press conference yesterday when he was asked to respond to attacks from 2 top runners for the Republican nomination next year, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater.
Governor Rockefeller says that he may have to withdraw his pledge not to raise taxes in New York State. The grounds he gives is that you had promised to achieve a certain economic growth rate in the country and you failed to keep that promise, and therefore he feels relieved of this pledge. Could you comment on this statement?
I saw all those campaign statements that were made in the fall of 1962 about how New York had moved ahead and all the rest, and I didn't see any acknowledgement that it was due in any way to the economic measures we've taken since '60 to provide for an increase in economic growth. I think there has been a substantial increase in the economic growth. New York has shared in it. I don't know what grounds on which Governor Rockefeller categorically made an assurance to the people of New York in the fall of '62 that is now impossible to fulfill. If he feels that it's my fault, then I'm prepared to accept that. I must say he's not really the only one. I got I suppose several thousands of letters when the stock market went way down in May and June 1962, blaming me and talking about the Kennedy market. I haven't gotten a single letter in the last few days about the Kennedy market now that it's broken through the Dow Jones average. So Governor Rockefeller is not alone in his disappointment.
As for Mr. Goldwater, in a Chicago speech Wednesday night, the senator warned against the administration's trend toward what he called, quote, a socialized welfare state and national bankruptcy, unquote. In the same speech, Mr. Goldwater also implied that President Kennedy had made secret deals with the Soviet Union.
In his Chicago speech last night, Senator Goldwater said there aren't 10 men in America who know the full truth about Cuba, all the facts of the test ban treaty, or the commitments made on behalf of this nation with governments dedicated to our destruction. He seems to be hinting that you made secret agreements both in the Cuban settlement last fall and to attain the test ban treaty.
No, that's not...
Could you say unequivocally that there were no commitments, and would you care to comment on Senator Goldwater?
Commitments, and I think that Senator Goldwater is at least one of the 10 men in America who know that that's not true. I think there are a good many other men. The fact of the matter is, as you know, we offered to have the correspondence in the test ban treaty made available to the leadership of the Senate. It stands on its own, so I can tell you very flatly there were no commitments made that have not been discussed or revealed, and I think most people know that.
Care to comment further on this type of attack by Senator Goldwater?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Sports, right after this.
Crest, the only toothpaste recognized effective by the American Dental Association. Here's the statement of their Therapeutics Council. Crest has been shown to be an effective, decay-preventive dentifrice that can be of significant value when used in a conscientiously applied program of oral hygiene and regular professional care. In your dental program, have regular checkups, watch between meal treats, brush often. With Crest, remember.
There were 34% fewer cavities with Crest.
In Minnesota tonight, the New York Yankees clinched their 28th American League pennant by shutting out the Twins 2-0. With the victory, Yankee starter Jim Bouton, in just his second year, joined Whitey Ford in the 20-win group for 1963 and struck out a career-high 11 batters. The final out was a foul pop, corralled by third baseman Clete Boyer. As the Bombers came charging out of the dugout, catcher Elston Howard, a strong candidate for American League MVP, lifted Bouton high in the air. In the Yankee clubhouse, there were champagne toasts to Bouton and Joe Pepitone and Johnny Blanchard as well, whose home runs nailed down the victory. Pepitone, eating a piece of melon with one hand and gulping pink champagne with the other, was the life of the party. Blanchard did not see the final out tonight, as he had had some sharp words for umpire Al Salerno after striking out in the 6th and was tossed from the game. Although the ejection may cost him some money, Johnny will still come out ahead, as it was his liquor store in Minneapolis that supplied the domestic champagne for tonight's celebration at retail. In the National League, the first-place Dodgers, who held a 7.5-game lead 3 weeks ago, now lead the second-place Cardinals by just 2.5 games after splitting a doubleheader with the Phillies today at Connie Mack Stadium. At Busch Stadium in St. Louis, the red-hot Cardinals bombarded Warren Spahn and the Braves 7-0. Johnny Keane's Cardinals have now won 7 in a row and 16 of their last 17 games. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Friday, September 13th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.